My students' parents demanded I write an apology letter because their son failed my class. I showed them their son's true nature. The parents of my student Logan were complaining why their child had low grades, even though he was an entitled, rude brat who spent every class disrupting lessons and refusing to do any work whatsoever. Mrs. Whitman and her husband Douglas scheduled a meeting demanding to know why their brilliant son was failing 8th grade English when he was obviously gifted, and I was clearly not challenging him enough. They sat across from me in the principal's office, claiming Logan told them I never taught anything useful, and just gave busy work while playing favorites with less intelligent students who needed extra attention. Mrs. Whitman said Logan was bored in my class because the material was beneath his advanced intellect, and that's why he didn't participate in the mindless assignments I distributed. Douglas added that Logan had always been ahead of his peers, and traditional teachers like me couldn't handle students who thought outside the box. They demanded I create a special advanced curriculum just for Logan that would engage his superior mind instead of forcing him to follow the same lessons as average students. The principal, Mr. Torres, sat there taking notes while the Whitmans explained how their son's genius was being suppressed by my inadequate teaching methods and outdated curriculum. They said Logan deserved better than a teacher who couldn't recognize exceptional talent when it was sitting in her classroom being failed by the system. Mrs. Whitman actually said that Logan had told them I was jealous of his intelligence and deliberately gave him bad grades to protect my ego from being challenged by a 13-year-old who was smarter than me. Douglas demanded all of Logan's grades be changed to A's immediately, and that I write an apology letter for damaging their son's academic record with my incompetence. They threatened to go to the school board about discriminatory grading practices if Logan's transcript wasn't fixed to reflect his true abilities. What they didn't know was that I'd been keeping detailed records of Logan's actual behavior, including his refusal to turn in 37 assignments, his habit of drawing inappropriate pictures instead of taking notes, and his constant disruption of other students who were trying to learn. Logan had called me stupid in front of the entire class, thrown books at other students, and written curse words on his tests instead of answers. He'd told me that his parents said school was pointless and teachers were failed professionals who couldn't succeed in the real world. When I showed the Whitmans Logan's actual test papers covered in drawings of middle fingers and curse words instead of essay responses, Mrs. Whitman said he was expressing frustration with boring questions that didn't stimulate his creativity. When I presented 37 missing assignments, Douglas said homework was outdated, and Logan learned better through experience than repetitive paperwork. When I played them a recording of Logan calling me an idiot who didn't deserve respect, they said he was practicing assertiveness, and I shouldn't be so sensitive. That's when I decided the Whitmans needed to experience their son's true nature without the filter of his lies. I arranged for them to observe the class through a two-way mirror, without Logan knowing they were watching. They sat in the observation room confident they'd see their genius son being oppressed by incompetent teaching. Instead, they watched Logan walk in 5 minutes late and announce that this class was worthless just like the teacher. They watched him refuse to take out his notebook and instead start flicking rubber bands at the girl in front of him. When I began the lesson on Shakespeare, Logan loudly declared that Shakespeare was for losers, and his parents said only idiots studied dead people's writing. Mrs. Whitman's face turned red as she heard her son quote her private comments about education. They watched Logan crumple up his worksheet and throw it at another student while declaring that his parents would get me fired if I gave him another bad grade. Douglas shifted uncomfortably when Logan bragged that his dad said teachers were minimum wage babysitters who couldn't get real jobs. When I asked Logan to read a passage aloud, he said reading was for nerds, and his mother told him successful people hire others to read for them. The Whitmans watched their son spend the entire class drawing obscene pictures, throwing things at classmates, and loudly interrupting every student who tried to answer questions. When a shy girl finally got courage to share her essay, Logan laughed and said it was garbage just like everything losers create. The girl started crying and Logan said tears were for weaklings whose parents didn't teach them to be winners. Mrs. Whitman was in tears herself watching her son bully other children while using her words as weapons. When class ended, Logan stayed behind and told me his parents were getting me fired at today's meeting, and he couldn't wait to watch me cry. He said his mother called me a pathetic failure who was jealous of successful families, and his father said I probably became a teacher because I couldn't do anything else. He walked out laughing about how his parents always believed him over stupid teachers. The Whitmans came back to the principal's office devastated by what they'd witnessed. Mrs. Whitman dropped into the observation room chair and buried her face in her hands. Her shoulders shook while she cried. Douglas stood against the wall like someone had frozen him in place. His earlier confidence was completely gone, and he just stared at nothing. Mr. Torres gave them a minute before he spoke quietly and asked if they wanted some water or needed a break before we kept talking. Mrs. Whitman shook her head without looking up, and her crying got quieter but didn't stop. Douglas finally moved and walked over to put his hand on his wife's shoulder, but he looked lost like he didn't know what else to do. The observation room felt too small and too quiet except for Mrs. Whitman's crying. I sat in my chair watching them and felt bad for them, even though they'd come in here an hour ago demanding I apologize and change their son's grades. They'd been so sure I was the problem and so confident Logan was this misunderstood genius. Now they'd seen exactly what I dealt with every single day in my classroom. Mr. Torres pulled out a box of tissues from his desk drawer and set it on the table between us. Mrs. Whitman finally took one and wiped her eyes, but she still couldn't look at anyone. She lifted her head and looked at me with red, puffy eyes. Her voice came out broken and rough when she asked how long Logan had been acting like that. I told her the truth that it had been the same since the first week of school back in September. That's why I started writing down everything so carefully and keeping all his papers and recording when he said things in class. I explained that I knew parents wouldn't just believe a teacher saying their kid was a problem, so I had to have proof of everything. Douglas moved away from the wall and sank down into the chair next to his wife. He said he had no idea their son was capable of treating people that way. His voice sounded hollow, like someone had knocked all the air out of him. Mrs. Whitman started crying again and said she couldn't believe the words coming out of Logan's mouth were things she'd said at home. She kept repeating that she'd taught him to be cruel without even realizing it. I didn't know what to say to that because it was true, but saying it out loud seemed mean. Douglas put his head in his hands and said they'd been telling Logan for years that school was a waste and teachers didn't know anything. He said they'd made Logan think being disrespectful was the same as being strong. Mr. Torres leaned forward in his chair and said, "We needed to talk about what happens next for Logan's education and behavior." He explained there would be consequences, but also support systems to help Logan learn better ways to act. Mrs. Whitman jumped in right away and said they'd accept whatever the school decided was right because clearly their judgment about their son was completely wrong. She said it fast, like she needed to get the words out before she lost her nerve. Douglas added that they owed me an apology for all the accusations they'd made and for demanding I write that letter. He looked directly at me for the first time since they came back from the observation room. His face was red and he looked embarrassed. I could see he meant the apology and wasn't just saying it because he had to. Mrs. Whitman nodded and said she was so sorry for calling me jealous and incompetent and all those other horrible things. She said she'd been completely wrong about everything. I told them I accepted their apology and appreciated them saying it. Then I explained that my bigger worry wasn't about me or my feelings, but about the students Logan had been bullying and messing with all semester. The shy girl who cried today wasn't the first kid Logan had targeted, and she probably wouldn't be the last if nothing changed. I said Logan had been going after her over and over again for months. Other students had learned it was safer to stay quiet in class than to risk saying something, and having Logan make fun of them. Mrs. Whitman's face went even more pale and she looked horrified. She asked if I could tell her which students had been affected, so she could apologize to their parents herself. Her hands were shaking when she reached for another tissue. I understood why she wanted to do that, but I also knew it wasn't that simple. Douglas looked sick, like he might throw up, and asked how many kids Logan had been mean to. I told him honestly that it wasn't just a few students, but basically the whole class at different times. Logan's behavior had affected everyone's ability to learn, because nobody wanted to participate when they knew he'd probably say something cruel about whatever they shared. Mr. Torres stepped in and gently said we needed to focus on Logan's immediate needs instead of the guilt his parents were feeling. He suggested bringing in the school counselor to figure out if Logan needed extra help beyond the normal discipline stuff. Douglas agreed right away and said they'd cooperate completely with whatever evaluation or therapy the school wanted to do. Mrs. Whitman nodded and wiped her eyes again. She said they'd pay for private therapy too if the school thought that would help. Mr. Torres made a note on his pad and said that was good to hear. He explained that Logan's behavior patterns were pretty serious and had been going on for months, so fixing it would take time and consistent effort from everyone. It wouldn't be a quick solution where Logan went to one counseling session and came back perfect. Douglas said they understood and they were ready to do whatever it took for as long as it took. Mrs. Whitman asked what would happen to Logan at the school while all this was getting set up. Mr. Torres said Logan would likely be suspended for a few days while they created a plan, and that when he came back there would be strict rules about his behavior with immediate consequences if he broke them. We spent the next 20 minutes scheduling a follow-up meeting for 2 days from now that would include the counselor and a district behavioral specialist. Mr. Torres pulled out his calendar and checked when everyone could meet. Mrs. Whitman wrote down the date and time in her phone with shaking hands. Then she asked if she could talk to the students Logan had hurt to apologize directly. Mr. Torres shook his head and explained that wouldn't be appropriate without their parents agreeing to it first, and it might actually make things worse for those kids. He said having Logan's mother show up could make them feel uncomfortable or scared or like they were in trouble somehow. Mrs. Whitman's face fell and she nodded slowly. She said she understood even though it was clear she really wanted to apologize to them. Then she asked what she and Douglas should say to Logan when he got home from the school today. Her voice was small and uncertain, like she didn't trust herself to handle her own son anymore. Douglas looked at Mr. Torres, waiting for an answer too. I spoke up and suggested they start by asking Logan about his day without telling him they'd watched the class. Let him have a chance to be honest about what happened and how he acted. Douglas looked doubtful and said based on what they'd just seen, Logan would probably lie and tell them everything was fine, like he always did. Mr. Torres agreed that was likely what would happen, but said it was still important to give Logan the opportunity to tell the truth before they confronted him with what they knew. He explained that how Logan responded to that first question would tell them a lot about whether he had any awareness that his behavior was wrong. If Logan lied, then they'd know he understood on some level that what he was doing was bad, even if he didn't want to admit it. If Logan told the truth, then that would be a starting point for a real conversation. Mrs. Whitman asked what they should do after Logan answered. Mr. Torres said they should tell him they watched his class today, and then let him react. He warned them that Logan would probably get angry and defensive and try to blame everyone else. The important thing was for them to stay calm and firm and not let Logan turn it around on them. Douglas asked if they should take away his phone and video games. Mr. Torres said consequences at home should match what they decided as a family, but that Logan needed to understand his behavior had real results that affected his life. The meeting wrapped up and Mrs. Whitman and Douglas stood to leave. They looked completely different from the confident, angry parents who'd walked in here demanding my job and an apology letter. Mrs. Whitman's eyes were still red and puffy, and she moved slowly like she was exhausted. Douglas kept his hand on her back as they walked to the door. Before they left, Mrs. Whitman turned back and said again that she was sorry, and that they'd do better. I told her I believed them, and that I hoped the meetings and counseling would help Logan. They walked out into the hallway, and I could hear their quiet voices fading as they headed toward the exit. Mr. Torres and I sat there for a few minutes not saying anything. The office felt very quiet after all that emotion and crying. Finally, Mr. Torres leaned back in his chair and said the observation was his idea. He'd seen too many cases over the years where parents refused to believe documented evidence no matter how much proof teachers provided. Sometimes seeing was the only thing that actually worked. He said he was sorry I'd had to deal with Logan's behavior for so long without the parents believing me. I told him I appreciated him setting up the observation, even though watching the Whitmans break down had been hard to witness. I left the principal's office and walked back through the empty hallways toward my classroom. Most students had gone home already since it was after the final bell. When I got to my door, I found the shy girl waiting there with her backpack on. She looked nervous and small, standing against the wall. As soon as she saw me, she asked if she was in trouble for crying during class. My heart broke hearing her ask that, like she'd done something wrong by having feelings when Logan was cruel to her. I unlocked my classroom door and told her to come in. I said she wasn't in trouble at all and that what Logan said to her was mean and completely unacceptable. I told her I was sorry I didn't stop him before he made her cry. She followed me into the room and set her backpack down on a desk. Her eyes were still a little red from earlier. I pulled out my chair and sat down so we'd be at the same eye level instead of me standing over her. She twisted her hands together and looked at the floor. She started talking quietly and told me Logan had been mean to her since elementary school, but it got way worse this year when she started trying to participate more in class. She said in 5th and 6th grade she mostly stayed quiet so Logan didn't notice her as much. But this year she decided she wanted to actually try in the school and share her ideas, and that's when Logan really started targeting her. Every time she raised her hand or answered a question, Logan would make some comment under his breath that other students could hear. If she read something out loud, he'd draw pictures making fun of her. When she turned in her creative writing assignment, Logan had grabbed it off my desk before I collected them all and wrote mean things on it. I asked her if she'd reported his behavior before today. She nodded and said she told her parents about it, but they said she needed to develop thicker skin and not let other kids bother her so much. They'd told her that learning to ignore bullies was an important life skill. She said she tried to ignore Logan, but it was hard when he was so loud and constant about it. I felt angry hearing that her parents had basically told her to just accept being bullied. I pulled out my notebook and made a note to reach out to her parents about what had been happening and let them know about the school's plan to deal with Logan's behavior. Maybe if they understood how serious and ongoing it was, they'd take it more seriously than just telling their daughter to toughen up. I told her parents needed to know what was really happening and that ignoring bullies just taught kids like Logan they could keep hurting others without consequences. She nodded slowly and asked if Logan would actually change or if he'd just get worse after being caught. I said honestly that I didn't know, but that at least now the school and his parents were aware of the problem and taking it seriously. She thanked me quietly and left my classroom looking a little less worried than when she'd arrived. I got to the school early the next morning and checked my email before the students arrived. There was a message from Mrs. Whitman sent at 2 in the morning with the subject line just saying Logan. I opened it and started reading. She wrote that she and Douglas had confronted Logan about his behavior as soon as they got home from the school. They asked him to tell them about his day, and specifically about my English class. Logan told them everything was fine and that I was still being unfair to him, but he was dealing with it. Mrs. Whitman wrote that hearing him lie so easily to their faces was painful, but they stayed calm and asked him more questions. Logan stuck to his story that I was the problem and he was the victim. Then they told him they'd watched his entire class through the observation window. Logan's face went white, according to Mrs. Whitman, and he immediately got defensive. He accused them of spying on him and said I must have set the whole thing up to make him look bad in front of them. He said it wasn't fair that they believed a teacher over their own son. Mrs. Whitman wrote that this response broke her heart because it showed Logan still didn't understand what he'd done wrong. He was more upset about being caught than about how he'd treated other people. She and Douglas tried to explain that his behavior was cruel and unacceptable, but Logan just got angrier and said they were taking my side. The email continued with Mrs. Whitman explaining the consequences they'd put in place. They took away Logan's phone and all his gaming systems until further notice. They told him he'd be going to counseling and following whatever behavior plan the school created. If he refused to cooperate or his behavior didn't improve, he'd be enrolled in the alternative school for students with serious behavior problems. Logan yelled that they were being unfair and that other parents would support their kids, but Douglas told him firmly that supporting him meant helping him fix his behavior, not defending it. Mrs. Whitman ended the email by saying she and Douglas had also scheduled family counseling for themselves because they clearly needed help understanding how their own attitudes had damaged their son. She apologized again for everything they'd said to me and thanked me for caring enough about Logan to document his behavior so carefully. I sat at my desk reading the email twice and feeling a mix of relief and sadness. Relief that the Whitmans were finally taking the situation seriously and putting real consequences in place. Sadness because I could tell from Mrs. Whitman's words how much pain this was causing their family, even though it was necessary pain that would hopefully lead to real change. My first period class started filtering in, and I got ready to begin the day's lesson on poetry analysis. Several students sat down and looked around the room with confused expressions. One boy raised his hand and asked where Logan was since he was usually here disrupting everything by now. I told the class simply that Logan was meeting with school administrators today and would return to class when the school decided he was ready. A girl in the third row said quietly that it was actually nice to be able to hear the lesson without someone constantly interrupting. Several other students nodded in agreement, and one boy added that he'd been afraid to answer questions before because Logan always made fun of anyone who tried to participate. I acknowledged their feelings and told them this classroom should be a safe place for everyone to learn and share ideas without fear of being mocked. We started the poetry lesson, and I noticed immediately how different the atmosphere felt. Students raised their hands without hesitation. The shy girl who Logan had bullied actually volunteered to read a poem aloud. Kids asked questions and discussed the material without looking around nervously to see if Logan was going to make fun of them. The class period flew by, and we covered more material than we usually did in twice the time because nobody was throwing things or yelling insults or deliberately derailing every discussion. During my lunch break, I headed to the staff room to eat and found 3 other teachers already there. As soon as I walked in, one of them stood up and came over to me. She taught science and said she'd heard about what happened with Logan and wanted to tell me she'd had similar problems with him in her classes. She said Logan had told her entire science class that his parents think female teachers are too emotional to handle smart students. Another teacher joined the conversation and shared that Logan regularly slept through her math class with his head down on the desk. When she'd contacted his parents about it, they blamed her for not making the material engaging enough to keep Logan awake. A third teacher said Logan had been disruptive in history class too, and had told other students that his dad said studying history was pointless because successful people focus on the future, not the past. I realized while listening to them that Logan's behavior had been affecting the entire school, not just my classroom. His attitude and disruptions were spreading across multiple classes and impacting dozens of students. The other teachers asked what the school was planning to do about Logan, and I told them there was a big meeting scheduled for this afternoon with his parents and some specialists. They all said they hoped something would actually change this time, because Logan had been a problem since the beginning of the school year, and it was only getting worse. The afternoon meeting started at 2 o'clock in the conference room next to the principal's office. Mr. Torres was already there along with the school counselor, and a woman I didn't recognize who turned out to be a behavioral specialist from the district office. The Whitmans arrived with Logan walking between them looking angry. Logan's arms were crossed over his chest and his expression was set in a defiant scowl. They all sat down around the conference table with Logan positioned between his parents. The counselor started the meeting by thanking everyone for coming and explaining that the goal was to create a plan to help Logan succeed both behaviorally and academically. She turned to Logan and asked him to describe what happened in my class yesterday. Logan immediately said I embarrassed him on purpose because I don't like him. He said I was always picking on him and trying to make him look bad in front of other students. The behavioral specialist leaned forward and asked Logan why he thought I didn't like him. Logan listed off reasons, but they were all actually consequences of his own behavior. He said I gave him bad grades even though he tried his best. He said I called on him when he didn't raise his hand just to embarrass him when he didn't know the answer. He said I made him redo assignments that he'd already turned in. The specialist asked him to explain that last part about redoing assignments. Logan hesitated and then admitted he hadn't actually turned in the assignments but said that shouldn't matter because the work was stupid anyway. The specialist made a note on her papers and asked if Logan understood why not turning in work would result in bad grades. Logan shrugged and said, "Schoolwork was pointless, busy work that didn't teach anything useful." Mrs. Whitman suddenly interrupted and told Logan she and his father had watched his entire class yesterday. Logan's defiant expression changed for the first time. His eyes went wide and his mouth opened slightly. Mrs. Whitman described in detail what they'd witnessed. She told him they heard him use their exact words to bully another student. She said they watched him throw things at classmates and refuse to do any work. She told him they heard him mock a girl until she cried and then call her weak. Mrs. Whitman's voice shook as she said she and Douglas were ashamed of what they'd taught him about education and respect. She said they never realized Logan was using their private complaints and frustrations as weapons to hurt other people. Logan tried to argue back. He said he was just repeating what they'd said at home. He said he thought that's what they wanted him to do. He said they always told him school was stupid and teachers were failures, so he was just agreeing with them. Douglas spoke up firmly and told his son that what they'd said at home was wrong. He said he and Mrs. Whitman were going to work on changing their attitudes as a family. The counselor made notes and said it seemed like Logan believed his parents' approval depended on him rejecting school and teachers. She said this was a dynamic they'd need to address in therapy sessions. The behavioral specialist pulled out some papers and started outlining a plan. Logan would attend counseling sessions twice a week. The whole family would go to therapy together once a week. Logan would sign a behavioral contract before returning to classes. For the first 2 weeks, he'd be on a shortened schedule, attending only his core classes with check-ins between each period. Any disruption or disrespect would result in immediate removal and a day of in-the-school suspension. The specialist explained that this plan would be reviewed after 2 weeks and adjusted based on Logan's progress. Logan protested immediately. He said the plan was unfair and too strict. He said other kids who got in trouble didn't have to do all this. Mr. Torres spoke up and told Logan directly that this was actually a generous alternative to expulsion. He said Logan's behavior had been unacceptable for months and had hurt other students who deserved a safe learning environment. He said the school had documentation of dozens of incidents and multiple teacher complaints. He told Logan he should consider himself lucky that the school was willing to give him another chance with support, instead of just removing him permanently. Logan stared down at the table and said nothing. His defiant expression was completely gone. For the first time since I'd known him, Logan sat there without a smart comment or excuse ready. I clear my throat and everyone looks at me. I tell Logan that I'm willing to work with him if he's actually ready to change how he acts and does his work. I say that I think he can do the assignments, which is why it's been so hard watching him refuse to even try. Logan looks at me for just a second with something on his face I can't figure out. Then he looks down at the table again without saying anything. The behavioral specialist slides the contract across the table, and Mr. Torres hands pens to everyone. Douglas signs first, then Mrs. Whitman, then the specialist, then Mr. Torres, then me. The contract sits in front of Logan with everyone waiting. He crosses his arms tighter and stares at the wall. Douglas leans toward his son and says quietly that Logan can either sign the paper or pack his stuff for alternative school tonight. Logan grabs the pen so hard I think it might break and scribbles his name across the signature line. He throws the pen down and crosses his arms again. Mrs. Whitman stands up and apologizes to me one more time before they leave. Her eyes are red and puffy like she's been crying on and off this whole time. 2 days pass before I see Logan again. He walks into my third period class carrying a yellow sheet of paper that Mr. Torres told me about. It's a check-in form that every teacher has to sign after each class to prove Logan attended and behaved appropriately. Logan sits down at the desk right in front of my teacher's desk, away from all the other students. Mr. Torres moved it there this morning before classes started. The other kids watch Logan carefully like they're waiting to see if he's going to explode or throw something. Nobody talks to him and he doesn't look at anyone. I start teaching the lesson about poetry analysis and Logan actually pulls out his notebook without me having to tell him. He doesn't raise his hand or look up at me, but he's not drawing pictures or flicking rubber bands either. When I walk around handing back the graded essays from last week, I stop at Logan's desk and give him a packet of papers. It's 10 of his missing assignments, the ones that are most important for understanding what we're learning now. He takes the packet without saying anything. The bell rings and students pack up their bags. Logan brings his yellow check-in sheet up to my desk and stands there waiting. He asks quietly how much the makeup work will count toward his grade. I tell him each assignment can get him partial credit if he actually completes it the right way. I explain that if he does the makeup work and does well on the upcoming tests, he could bring his grade from failing to maybe passing. He nods and takes the check-in sheet back after I sign it. He doesn't make any comments about how grades are stupid or pointless like he used to. After school ends, I'm organizing papers at my desk when the shy girl comes in. She stops in the doorway looking nervous. She tells me she feels safer in class now that Logan sits at the front where everyone can see him. She says she's thinking about joining the creative writing club since she won't have to worry about Logan making fun of her for it. I tell her she should definitely join and that I'm proud of her for not letting Logan's mean behavior stop her from doing what she likes. She smiles a little and says she'll sign up tomorrow. A week goes by with Logan following his behavioral plan. Mrs. Whitman sends me an email late one night updating me about their family counseling sessions. She writes that the therapist helped her and Douglas understand how their own problems with their jobs and lives made them think education was worthless. They've been teaching Logan that being successful means rejecting authority instead of working within the system, which set him up to fail at the school. She says realizing this pattern has been really hard but necessary for their family to change. Logan turns in his first makeup assignment on Thursday morning. It's an essay analyzing the short story we read back in September. The handwriting is messy, and he barely wrote enough to meet the minimum requirements, but it's complete and shows he actually read the story. I grade it and give him a C- with notes written in the margins about how to make it better. It's honest feedback instead of the automatic F his blank papers used to get. During Friday's class discussion about a poem, Logan raises his hand. I stare at him for a second because he's never raised his hand once this entire year. I call on him carefully, and he makes a basic comment about the imagery that actually relates to what we're talking about. Two students turn around to look at him with shocked expressions. One girl whispers something to her neighbor. I thank Logan for contributing and use his comment to talk more about the deeper meaning in the poem. The school counselor stops me in the hallway after school. She asks how Logan is doing in my class specifically since I'm the teacher his parents attacked. I tell her honestly that he's doing the bare minimum, but he hasn't disrupted class or been disrespectful in 2 weeks. She says that's actually really good progress for someone with Logan's established behavior patterns. She asks if I've noticed any positive interactions between Logan and the other students. I think about it and realize I haven't seen Logan interact with anyone at all. He sits alone at the front, does his work quietly, and leaves as soon as class ends. The counselor writes something down in her notes and says she'll keep monitoring the situation. I tell her honestly that Logan sits alone at his desk in the front row and walks out the second class ends without talking to anyone. The counselor writes something in her notebook and suggests we could try moving him to a regular seat after 4 weeks of good behavior to see if he can keep improving without being separated from everyone else. I'm not sure that's a good idea yet, but I agree to think about it if he actually keeps following the rules. 3 weeks pass and Logan walks into class on Monday morning carrying his backpack instead of just his phone like usual. He sits down at his front row desk, unzips the bag, and pulls out his current homework assignment, plus 3 more makeup papers from earlier in the semester. I collect them during my rounds and notice the handwriting is messy, and he barely wrote enough to meet the requirements, but everything is actually complete. When I grade them that afternoon and return them the next day, Logan picks up his papers and reads through my feedback comments in the margins, instead of crumpling them into his backpack like he used to do. His expression stays neutral, but he puts the papers carefully into his folder, which is more respect for his work than I've seen from him all year. Mrs. Whitman sends me an email requesting another meeting to talk about Logan's progress and what they're working on in family therapy. She and Douglas arrive at my classroom after school looking exhausted, calmer than they were during our last conversation. They sit across from my desk, and Mrs. Whitman explains that their therapist has been helping them rebuild their relationship with Logan based on honesty and holding him responsible for his actions, instead of defending everything he does no matter what actually happened. Douglas adds that they're learning to stop making excuses for behavior they know is wrong, just because he's their son. Douglas leans forward and tells me that Logan admitted during one of their therapy sessions that he knew his behavior at the school was wrong the whole time. He thought acting tough and rejecting everything about school was what made his parents proud of him, because that's what they always seemed to value when they talked at home. Now Logan feels confused because following rules and being respectful feels like he's betraying the identity his parents spent years building up in him. Their therapist is working with Logan to understand that real strength means admitting when you're wrong and putting in effort to get better, not just refusing to care about anything. I tell them that Logan's behavior in my class has been acceptable for the past few weeks, and he's starting to turn in assignments, though his actual skills are pretty far behind where they should be after months of refusing to try at all. Mrs. Whitman asks if I think Logan can pass 8th grade this year, and I answer honestly that it depends on whether he keeps working this hard through the end of the semester and how well he does on the remaining assignments and tests. If he maintains this effort, he has a chance, but if he goes back to his old patterns, he'll definitely fail. 4 weeks after the observation room incident, Mr. Torres approves moving Logan back to sitting with the rest of the class instead of isolated at the front. I place his desk in a middle row instead of the back corner where he used to sit, positioning him near students who focus on their work, but not near the ones he targeted before. When Logan walks in the next morning and sees the new seating arrangement, he pauses for a second looking at his relocated desk, then walks over and sits down without saying anything. He takes out his notebook and waits for class to start like it's completely normal. During our poetry unit, the shy girl raises her hand and volunteers to read her creative writing piece out loud to the class. I'm surprised because she's never been willing to share her work before, probably because she was afraid of Logan making fun of her. She stands up and reads her poem about feeling invisible, and when she finishes, several students clap. I glance over at Logan, expecting to see him rolling his eyes or making faces, but his expression is just neutral. He's not smiling or clapping, but he's not mocking her either, which might not sound like much, but represents real change from the cruel comments he used to make whenever she tried to participate. Logan stays after class one afternoon and waits until the other students leave before approaching my desk. He asks awkwardly if he can rewrite one of his earlier tests from the beginning of the semester, now that he actually understands the material we covered. I'm genuinely surprised by him taking this kind of initiative and tell him I'll allow one test retake if he completes a study guide first, to show me he's actually prepared and not just hoping for an easy grade boost. He agrees immediately and takes the study guide packet I hand him without complaining about the extra work. 2 days later, Logan returns the completed study guide with his answers filled in carefully. I look through it quickly and see genuine effort to understand the concepts instead of random guesses or joke answers. I schedule his test retake for the following week and tell him he can use his notes during the test, which is more help than I'd normally give but feels right considering everything he's been working through. He thanks me quietly before leaving, and I realize that might actually be the first time I've ever heard him say, "Thank you for anything." The following week, Logan sits at his desk taking the retake test while the rest of the class works on independent reading. He focuses carefully on each question and uses the full class period instead of giving up after 10 minutes like he used to. When I grade his test that evening, he scored a C+, which brings his overall grade up from an F to a D. It's still not passing, but it's not the failing grade he's been carrying all semester either. When I return the graded test the next day, Logan looks at the score and allows himself a small smile before quickly hiding it, like he's not entirely sure he's allowed to feel good about his work. A few days later, an email from Mrs. Whitman arrives in my inbox at almost midnight. She writes that their family therapy session got really intense when the therapist asked Logan directly what he thought would happen if he became a good student. Logan sat there quiet for a long time before finally admitting he was scared his parents would be disappointed in him. Mrs. Whitman says she didn't understand at first, until Logan explained that everything they'd taught him his whole life was about being tough and not caring what teachers thought. He said becoming someone who actually tried in the school and respected teachers felt like betraying everything his parents valued about him. Douglas apparently started crying right there in the therapist's office when he realized their son believed their love was tied to him being defiant and rejecting education. The email goes on for several paragraphs about how hearing Logan's fear broke her heart completely. She writes that she and Douglas spent years building an identity for their family based on being too good for traditional education, and now they're working to tear that down and rebuild something healthier. They're trying to show Logan that success includes education and respect, rather than rejecting both. But it's hard to undo 13 years of the wrong messages. She ends by thanking me again for forcing them to see the truth, even though it was painful. 6 weeks after Logan started his behavioral plan, the district specialist schedules a progress review meeting. I arrive at the conference room to find her already there with a thick folder of documentation from all of Logan's teachers. She starts by reviewing the numbers and reports that Logan has had exactly 0 disciplinary incidents since the plan began. No disruptions, no disrespect, no bullying of other students. His attendance has been perfect, and he's been on time to every class. She flips through teacher reports showing he's completed about 60% of his assigned work across all subjects. His math teacher notes he's quiet but cooperative. His science teacher says he participates occasionally when called on. His history teacher reports he turns in assignments that meet basic requirements without going beyond them. The specialist says Logan is clearly following the rules of his behavioral contract, but he's not actively engaged with learning yet. He's doing what he has to do to avoid consequences rather than developing genuine interest in the school. She recommends continuing the current plan through the end of the semester, with monthly check-ins instead of weekly ones. Mr. Torres agrees and says he'll schedule the next review for 4 weeks out. The specialist tells me privately after the meeting that this level of behavioral change in just 6 weeks is actually really significant for a student with Logan's established patterns. She says plenty of kids in similar situations don't make it past the first week without major incidents. The following afternoon, Logan stays after class and waits until the other students leave before approaching my desk. He shifts his weight from foot to foot and won't quite meet my eyes when he asks if he can join the after-school homework help program. I'm genuinely surprised because the program is completely voluntary and requires staying late twice a week. Most students avoid extra time at the school if they can. I tell him absolutely he can join, and that I think it's a great idea. I make a note to email the program coordinator right away to let her know about Logan's behavioral plan so she can support his continued progress and know what to watch for. Logan nods and asks when the next session is. I tell him it's tomorrow after school in the library and runs from 3 to 4. He takes out his planner and writes it down carefully before thanking me and leaving. The next day, I check with the coordinator and she confirms Logan showed up right at 3, found a quiet spot at a table in the back, and worked on makeup assignments for the full hour without any issues. A few days later, the shy girl approaches Logan after class while I'm erasing the board. I keep one eye on them while appearing focused on cleaning up, ready to step in if needed. She asks him quietly if he understood the homework assignment, because she's confused about what we're supposed to analyze in the poem. Logan looks surprised that she's talking to him, but he explains the assignment clearly without any trace of mockery in his voice. He tells her we need to identify 3 examples of imagery and explain what each one means in the context of the poem. She thanks him and starts to walk away, but then turns back and asks if he knows what imagery means exactly. Logan thinks for a second and says it's when the writer describes things in ways that make you picture them in your mind using your senses. The girl nods and thanks him again before leaving. Logan stands there looking slightly confused by what just happened, like he's not entirely sure how to process a positive interaction with a classmate. He glances at me and I give him a small nod before he gathers his things and heads out. Mrs. Whitman's next email arrives on a Sunday evening. She writes that their family therapist told them at this week's session that she thinks they're making real progress in changing the family dynamics that led to Logan's behavior. The therapist has them working on exercises where they practice responding to frustrations about work and life without putting down education or teachers. Mrs. Whitman says it's harder than she expected because those negative attitudes became such automatic responses over the years. She writes about catching herself mid-sentence when she started to complain about her boss by saying he probably couldn't do anything else, so he became a manager. She stopped herself and reframed it to say her boss makes decisions she disagrees with, but she needs to find professional ways to address those concerns. Douglas is working on similar changes, and they're both trying to model respect for education and authority, even when they're frustrated with their own lives. The email says Logan is slowly starting to accept that his parents' love isn't conditional on him being defiant and rejecting learning. He's still quiet and withdrawn at home, but he's not arguing with them about school anymore. Mrs. Whitman ends by saying she knows Logan has a long way to go, but she's hopeful they're finally moving in the right direction as a family. With 3 weeks left in the semester, I pull up Logan's current grades and see he's brought his overall score up to a D+. I do some quick calculations and realize he needs to score at least a B on the final exam to pass the class with a C-. It's possible, but it will require real effort and preparation. I call Logan up to my desk after class and show him the numbers. I explain exactly what he needs to accomplish and suggest we create a study plan for the remaining weeks. Logan takes out his notebook without being asked and starts writing as I outline what material the final exam will cover. We identify the areas where he's weakest, and I give him specific assignments to work on those skills. He asks questions about format and content that show he's actually thinking about the exam rather than just going through motions. When we finish the study plan, he looks at it for a long moment before asking if I really think he can score a B. I tell him honestly that I think he can if he puts in the work, but it won't be easy and he'll need to use all the resources available, including homework help sessions. He nods and says he'll try. Over the next 2 weeks, Logan shows up to homework help sessions every Tuesday and Thursday without fail. He works through practice problems and study materials with focus I never saw from him before. In class, he starts raising his hand occasionally to ask questions when he doesn't understand something. The first time he does it, several students turn around to stare, but I answer his question normally and keep the lesson moving. Other students gradually stop watching him nervously and seem to accept that he's not the same disruptive presence he was at the beginning of the year. During a paired reading activity, one student actually chooses Logan as a partner, which surprises both of them. I watch them work together and see Logan explaining a passage to his partner without any attitude or mockery. The other student nods and they continue reading together like it's completely normal. The school counselor stops me in the hallway one morning to tell me she's been tracking Logan's progress across all his classes. She says his other teachers report similar improvements to what I've seen. He's completing work in math, participating occasionally in science, treating everyone with basic respect in history. His PE teacher notes he follows instructions and works with teammates appropriately during group activities. The counselor says this level of behavioral change in just 8 weeks is really significant, and suggests Logan is genuinely working to change rather than just going through the motions to avoid consequences. She's seen plenty of students who can fake compliance for a week or two, but maintaining it this long while also improving academically shows real effort. She asks if I think Logan will pass my class, and I tell her it depends entirely on how he does on the final exam. She says she'll check in with him before exam week to make sure he's prepared and feeling supported. An email from Douglas arrives separately from his wife's usual messages. He writes that he wanted to thank me personally for giving Logan opportunities to improve, rather than writing him off as a lost cause after his terrible behavior. He says watching their son actually try in the school over these past weeks has made him and Mrs. Whitman realize how much damage their attitudes caused. They spent years teaching Logan that school was pointless, and teachers were failures, and now they're seeing what happens when a kid actually believes that message and acts on it. Douglas writes that they're proud of Logan for doing the hard work of changing his behavior and rebuilding his academic skills, even though it would be easier to just give up. He says Logan comes home tired from homework help sessions, but he keeps going back, which shows a level of commitment they weren't sure he had in him. The email ends with Douglas saying he hopes Logan passes my class, but that regardless of the grade, he's grateful Logan learned something more important about effort and respect. Final exam day arrives and Logan walks in looking nervous but determined. He takes his seat and waits quietly while I distribute the test packets. When I tell the class to begin, Logan opens his packet and starts reading the first question carefully. I watch him work his way through the exam using the full class period instead of giving up after 10 minutes like he used to do. He refers to his notes occasionally, reads passages multiple times, and writes detailed responses to essay questions. Other students finish and turn in their exams, but Logan keeps working until the bell rings. He brings his completed exam to my desk, and I can see his hand shaking slightly as he sets it down. I tell him he'll get his results tomorrow, and he nods before leaving. That evening, I settle in to grade the stack of final exams. When I get to Logan's test, I read through his responses carefully. His essays show understanding of the material we covered, and his analysis questions demonstrate actual thought rather than random guesses. He scored a B- on the exam. I pull up my gradebook and enter the score, then watch as his final semester grade calculates to exactly a C-. He passed my class by the smallest possible margin, but he passed through genuine effort rather than grade manipulation or parental pressure. On the last day of class, Logan walks to my desk and places a folded piece of paper on the stack of final exams I'm organizing. He doesn't meet my eyes when he sets it down, just mumbles that it's from his parents and turns to leave. I unfold the note and recognize Mrs. Whitman's handwriting thanking me for my patience throughout the semester and for keeping such careful records of Logan's behavior. She writes that without my documentation, they never would have been forced to see the truth about what they'd taught their son. The note says they're grateful I gave Logan chances to improve, instead of giving up on him completely. Logan appears at my desk again a few minutes later after most students have left, and says quietly that he's sorry for how he acted all semester. His voice is barely above a whisper, and he's staring at the floor like he can't bring himself to look at me. I tell him I appreciate the apology, and that I'm genuinely proud of the work he's done to turn things around these past weeks. He nods once and walks out quickly before I can say anything else. That evening, I attend the end-of-year showcase in the school auditorium, where students present creative projects they worked on throughout the semester. The shy girl takes the stage looking nervous but determined, and begins reading her creative writing piece about finding courage to share your voice, even when people try to silence you. Her words are powerful and personal, and when she finishes, the audience erupts in enthusiastic applause. I scan the crowd and spot Logan sitting with his parents near the back of the auditorium. He's not clapping with much energy, but he is clapping, his hands coming together in a steady rhythm that shows basic respect. Mrs. Whitman has tears streaming down her face as she watches her son show even this small sign of decency toward a classmate he spent months tormenting. Douglas has his arm around his wife's shoulders, and he's watching Logan with an expression that mixes pride and sadness. After the showcase ends, I see the Whitmans leaving through the side door, and Mrs. Whitman catches my eye and mouths thank you before they disappear into the parking lot. The following week, Mr. Torres schedules an end-of-year meeting to review Logan's behavioral plan and determine what requirements he'll need to follow next year. The counselor, the behavioral specialist, Logan, and his parents all gather in the conference room to discuss his progress. Mr. Torres opens the meeting by acknowledging that Logan has made significant improvements over the past 2 months and asks the counselor to share her assessment. She reports that Logan has attended all required sessions, participated in activities, and shown real effort to understand how his behavior affected other people. The behavioral specialist adds that Logan's teachers across all subjects have reported consistent cooperative behavior with no major incidents since the plan was implemented. Mr. Torres asks Logan directly what he wants for 9th grade, and Logan says without hesitation that he wants to start high school without the reputation he built in middle school. He says he knows people will remember how he acted, but he wants a chance to show he's different now. The consensus among the adults is that Logan should continue counseling through the summer with sessions every other week instead of twice weekly. For 9th grade, he'll start on a modified monitoring plan that requires weekly check-ins with his guidance counselor, but not the intensive daily tracking he had this semester. Logan agrees to the plan without argument and actually thanks everyone for helping him, which surprises me given how resistant he was to any kind of help just months ago. Mrs. Whitman asks if there's anything else they should be doing as a family, and the counselor suggests they maintain their family therapy sessions at least monthly to keep working on the patterns they've started to change. 2 days after the meeting, I open my email to find a message from the shy girl's mother. She writes that she wanted to thank me personally for creating a safer classroom environment in the second half of the year. Her daughter's confidence has grown so much since Logan stopped bullying her and other students. She's excited to continue with creative writing in high school, and has even started working on a collection of poems over the summer. The mother mentions that her daughter told her I was the first teacher who took Logan's bullying seriously, instead of telling her to just ignore it or develop thicker skin. She says her daughter finally feels like school can be a place where she belongs, instead of somewhere she has to survive. Reading the email makes me realize how much impact one student's behavior can have on an entire classroom, and how many students suffer in silence when teachers don't address bullying directly. I write back thanking her for the message and telling her how proud I am of her daughter's courage and talent. Mrs. Whitman emails me a week before summer break, officially starts asking if we can meet one more time to update me on their family progress. We meet at a coffee shop near the school since the building is mostly empty during the break period. She looks different from she did in our previous meetings, less defensive and more genuine in her expressions. She tells me their therapist has helped them understand that changing Logan's behavior required changing their entire family system, not just punishing Logan or forcing him to act differently. She and Douglas are working on building a home environment that values education, respects teachers, and holds Logan accountable while still supporting him emotionally. She admits they spent years teaching Logan that school was pointless and teachers were failures, and now they're trying to undo that damage while also examining why they developed those attitudes in the first place. Douglas joins us halfway through the conversation and adds that watching Logan actually try in the school has made them both realize how their own frustrations with their careers led them to dismiss education entirely. He says they're proud of Logan for doing the hard work of changing, even though it would be easier to just keep blaming everyone else like they taught him to do. Logan completes his last counseling session of the school year in mid-June, and the counselor sends a positive report to Mr. Torres. She writes that Logan has developed better skills for managing his emotions and is starting to understand how his behavior affected other people beyond just getting him in trouble. She notes that Logan still has work to do, but he's made real progress in taking responsibility for his actions instead of deflecting blame. The counselor recommends he continue therapy through the summer with sessions every other week to maintain the momentum he's built before transitioning to high school in the fall. Mr. Torres forwards me the report with a note saying he's cautiously optimistic about Logan's chances for success in 9th grade, as long as the support systems stay in place. On the actual final day of school, when students come to clean out their lockers and say goodbye, several kids stop by my classroom to talk. 3 different students tell me they're glad Logan changed his behavior because the class became so much better in the second half of the year. One boy says he was afraid to participate in discussions before because Logan made fun of everyone who tried to answer questions. He says once Logan stopped being mean, it was actually fun to talk about the readings and share ideas. Another student mentions that she almost asked her parents to transfer her to a different English class because Logan's constant disruptions made it impossible to learn. She's glad she stayed because the second semester was completely different. Listening to these students makes me realize how much Logan's behavior had suppressed the entire class's engagement and learning. His bullying created an environment where students were afraid to participate, afraid to be themselves, afraid to try. Changing one student's behavior didn't just help that one student, it freed an entire classroom of kids to actually learn and grow. Over the summer, I run into the Whitmans at a community event in the town park. Logan is with them looking more relaxed than I've ever seen him at the school. Mrs. Whitman tells me Logan is working part-time at a local bookstore, which was his therapist's suggestion to help him develop a more positive relationship with reading and learning. She says Logan actually seems to enjoy the job and has been reading some of the books he sells, which is something they never thought they'd see. Douglas adds that Logan comes home talking about the books he's reading and sometimes even recommends titles to customers, showing knowledge he claims he doesn't have. Logan stands slightly behind his parents during this conversation, looking embarrassed but not angry like he would have been months ago. When his parents finish talking, he says briefly that the job is okay, and some of the books are actually interesting. It's not an enthusiastic endorsement, but coming from Logan, it represents significant growth. In late August, the bookstore manager contacts the school to provide a reference for Logan's high school records. She reports that Logan has been a reliable employee who shows up on time, works well with customers, and takes direction without attitude. She mentions in her reference that Logan told her about his behavioral problems last year and said he's trying to be different now. The manager writes that she's impressed by a teenager taking that kind of responsibility for past mistakes instead of making excuses. She says Logan is quiet and keeps to himself, but he's helpful when customers need assistance, and he's learned the inventory system quickly. Mr. Torres adds the reference to Logan's file and emails me a copy saying it's good to see Logan's progress extending beyond school into other areas of his life. When school starts again in the fall, I'm walking down the hallway on the first day, and I see Logan near the freshman lockers looking nervous but determined. He's taller than he was in 8th grade, and his posture is different, less aggressive and defensive. I check the class rosters later and see he's enrolled in standard English rather than remedial classes, which means his final grades from last year were sufficient for regular placement. A few days into the school year, I pass Logan in the hallway between classes, and we make eye contact. He nods at me, just a simple acknowledgement, and I nod back. Neither of us says anything, but we both know that small gesture represents significant growth from where he started last year. He's not the same kid who walked into my classroom last September, ready to disrupt and destroy. He's not completely transformed either, but he's trying, and sometimes that's enough. A few days into the new school year, the shy girl appears at my classroom door during my planning period holding a folder against her chest. She looks different from she did last year, standing taller with more confidence in her posture. She asks if she has a minute to talk, and I wave her in, curious about what brought her back to my classroom. She sits in one of the student desks and opens the folder to show me a printed page with her name at the top. Her face lights up as she explains she's taking a creative writing class at the high school, and one of her poems got picked for the school's literary magazine. I lean forward to look at the poem and recognize her distinctive voice in the careful word, choices, and honest emotions. She tells me she wanted to thank me for protecting her and the other students from Logan's bullying last year, because it gave her the courage to keep writing. She says if Logan had kept making fun of everyone who tried to share their work, she probably would have given up on creative writing completely. I tell her I'm proud of her courage and talent, and that watching her discover her love of writing was one of the best parts of last year despite everything else that happened. She smiles and says she's actually excited about English class now instead of dreading it, which makes all the difficult meetings and confrontations with the Whitmans feel worth it. Later that week, Mr. Torres stops by my classroom after school to give me an update on Logan's progress at the high school. He says Logan's 9th grade teachers report he's starting the year with cooperative behavior and completed work, though he stays quiet in class and doesn't volunteer to answer questions or participate in discussions. The high school counselor is keeping an eye on his progress, and he's still going to therapy once a month to maintain the changes he made. Mr. Torres leans against my desk and admits the situation turned out better than he expected, considering how deep Logan's behavioral problems went and how defensive the Whitmans were at the beginning. He says most cases like Logan's either end with the student getting expelled or the parents pulling them out to homeschool rather than face the truth. The fact that Logan actually changed his behavior and the Whitmans took responsibility for their role in creating the problem is unusual enough that the district asked him to document the case as a potential model for handling similar situations. Sitting at my desk after Mr. Torres leaves, I think back over everything that happened with Logan and his parents. I'm glad I kept such careful records of Logan's behavior and that Mr. Torres supported my plan to let the Whitmans observe the class, even though watching their devastation in that moment was genuinely hard. Logan's transformation wasn't some dramatic redemption story where he suddenly became a model student who loved learning. He made real progress, though, going from a kid who disrupted class every single day and bullied other students to someone who completes his work and treats people with basic respect. Sometimes the best outcome isn't perfect redemption, but genuine effort toward change. I'm cautiously hopeful that Logan will keep building on the foundation he started last semester, and that the Whitmans will continue supporting him in healthier ways than they did before. The shy girl's visit reminded me why I fought so hard to address Logan's behavior, instead of just passing him along to the next teacher. Creating a safe classroom where students can take risks and discover their talents matters more than avoiding difficult conversations with defensive parents.